Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Miss Tillotson's gray parrot had called Clarissa many times, and now it waited, with its clever head turned to one side, listening for sounds on the stairs. Breakfast was ready. A big pot, shaped like a monument, was steaming on the table. Next to it was an old jar with fresh roses in it. At 8:15, Clarissa Tillotson came downstairs and walked into the room quickly and firmly, not paying attention to the parrot's greeting. She was a tall, fair-skinned young woman of 19. Her hair was almost blonde, worn in short curls, as was the style at that time. Her eyes were light blue, and her face was regular and even. If it weren't for the serious look around her mouth, she would have been called beautiful. She wore a white muslin dress with a blue belt. The top of the dress was square-cut, so her neck was uncovered. Her sleeves were tight and reached to her wrists. The dress fit her body closely and made her look even taller than she was. To this day, on the wall of a modern London house, Clarissa's grandchildren and great-grandchildren can see her in a dusty, golden frame, wearing the same clothes she wore that morning. "Good morning, Anthony," she said stiffly as a young man, 2 years older than her, walked in. "Good morning, sister," he replied in a cheerful voice, stepping closer as if he wanted to give her a kiss. But Clarissa stood very straight and quickly turned to the table. Anthony's face turned red with anger. They had argued the day before, and Anthony wanted to be the first to make peace. But he could see that Clarissa wanted to keep her distance, and he knew her stubborn personality too well to try again. He sat down with a sigh, thinking how nice their home would be if her hard temper didn't so often block the happiness of family life. "Father is not well enough to come down yet," he said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "He plans to come down this afternoon." "Dr. Vale told him to be very careful," answered Clarissa. These young people had no mother. The daughter acted as the lady of the house, with only her father's control, which was very gentle. Captain Tillotson was a very kind father. His wife had died when Clarissa was too young to remember her, and the girl was raised by an old servant who let her do what she wanted. At school, she had to follow the rules, but her strong will never changed, and she often found ways to be in charge of her classmates. When Captain Tillotson retired from many years of honorable work in the Royal Navy, he settled down at home to enjoy his old age in peace, and Clarissa was a loving daughter. But Anthony was not as easy for her to control as her father was. He did not always listen to his sister, and she sometimes found herself kindly corrected by him. "If I give in," she thought, remembering their argument, "he will think he has won. No, I will stay cold with him until he says sorry." Anthony felt hurt by his sister's coldness and didn't try much to keep the conversation going. They finished breakfast in silence, and he got up from the table quickly. "I'm going to visit the Royal George this morning," he said, walking toward the door. "If father asks for me, Clarissa, Please tell him that I wanted to speak with Lieutenant Holloway. He have to sail again soon." "Very well," answered Clarissa in an uncaring voice. Anthony closed the door behind him, and she rang the bell for the servants to clear the breakfast table. Then, feeling the warm sunshine, she decided to walk in the garden and pick some lavender. But for some reason, her mind was troubled. She couldn't enjoy her flowers or feel happy about the vine she had cared for so carefully. So she went back inside, planning to spend the morning working on her embroidery. Sitting near the open window, she brought her embroidery frame closer and set up her colorful threads. Her needle flashed in and out, and soon she was deeply focused on her work. Every piece of work has its own story, and this picture she was making of the woman from Samaria would become very meaningful to future generations. But Clarissa had no idea that this morning's work would one day remind her of the darkest hours of her life. She worked until the old clock in the hall struck 10. At that moment, a sudden gust of wind blew into the room, scattering rose petals from the jar on the table and tossing Clarissa's curls around her head. The breeze was refreshing after the hot stillness, so she stood up between the two windows to enjoy it. Then, after walking back and forth in the long room for a while, she sat down at her frame again and started thinking about her brother, Anthony. Had she acted the right way? Shouldn't she have accepted his peace offering, a friendly kiss? Was it really so good to hold out until her enemy apologized? Even if he said sorry, would it be worth it? Would it feel like a real win, or would it feel like the kind of victory that makes the winner look small instead of great? Anthony was a good person, a brother most girls would be proud of. His only fault was that he stuck to his own opinion. But was that really a fault? She worked faster, almost deciding that it wasn't. Her mind was so busy with these thoughts that time passed quickly, and she was surprised when she heard the clock strike 1. As soon as the sound faded, a loud, shrill cry echoed down the quiet street, draining the color from her face. Jumping up from her chair, she hurried to the window overlooking the sidewalk and saw people coming to their doors, looking scared. A woman was standing in the street, shouting in a terrible voice. "It's all true, it's all true," she screamed. "The Royal George has gone down at Spithead." The two maidservants rushed upstairs, frightened, for they had also heard the cry. Captain Tillotson heard it from his room above and came down in his dressing gown and slippers. But his daughter barely stopped to say a word to him. Without thinking, she grabbed her garden hat and shawl from the hall, put them on, and ran out into the street, heading quickly toward the dockyard gates. Could this news be true? Sadly, she found out it was confirmed before she even reached the dockyard, and the first whale was only the start of many more. Even in that moment of deep sadness and fear, people noticed the tall, fair young lady whose face and lips were as pale as the white dress she wore. The Royal George had recently returned to Spithead after a voyage, and on that tragic morning, The ship was tilted to one side in an operation called a Parliament heel. The sea was calm and the weather was peaceful, so the work started early. Many workers from Portsmouth Dockyard had gone on board to help the ship's carpenters. They found they needed to remove more of the ship's covering than they had first planned, and the men, trying to reach a problem area on the ship's bottom, tilted her too far. Then, a sudden breeze shook the ship's ropes, and she tipped completely to one side. The heavy cannons rolled to the lower side, water poured in, and the strong ship was lost. This was the story that Clarissa heard, in quick and shaky words, from an old sailor. But he couldn't tell her anything more. The fleet's boats had gone out to rescue people, but that was all he knew. Clarissa felt no hope in her heart as she walked back home. Anthony had gone down with Admiral Kempenfelt and the other 800 people on board. The same breeze that had blown the rose petals and played with her curls had carried a much sadder purpose. She remembered how she had enjoyed that sudden, cool wind, and thinking about it made her feel weak and sick as she reached her father's house. Clarissa called Captain Tillotson as he met her at the door. "What is all this? It can't be true. Where's Anthony?" Yes, where was Anthony? She wrapped her arms around her father's neck and pressed her face against his shoulder to avoid seeing his face. "Father, dear father." He said he was going to see Lieutenant Holloway on board. She couldn't finish the sentence. There was no need to say more. Captain Tillotson was a brave man. He had faced danger many times without fear. But this was a shock he was not ready for. Gently moving his daughter aside, he sat down on a sofa and looked straight ahead, with a blank expression that showed his strength had been crushed. The servants, looking from the father to the daughter, saw that this sudden sadness had aged both of them. It was as if years had passed in those few minutes since the first terrible cry had echoed through the street. "If I had only kissed him," Clarissa whispered, not realizing she was speaking out loud. For her, this pain was even worse because it was mixed with regret. If she hadn't been so hard, she could have had the comfort of a kind goodbye. Had Anthony forgiven her in his gentle heart, while the great ship was sinking and the water was taking his life? She might never know that answer until the sea gave back its dead. She heard the sound of wheels in the street, but she didn't care. The noise came closer. The wheels stopped at the door. It was probably just someone coming quickly to share the sad news they already knew. Bruised, battered, and dripping with water, a man got down from the carriage and Clarissa jumped up. The face was pale and he looked strange, so she couldn't fully believe what she saw. It wasn't until he walked into the room and knelt, wet and shaking, at his father's feet that she realized her brother was safe. Anthony had been on the upper deck when the ship sank and was one of the few who survived. Those who were below deck were lost, along with the great admiral, who sank with his sword still in its sheath after 70 years of hard service, so close to shore. Many lives were lost, and many homes were filled with sorrow that day. But from some homes, prayers of thankfulness rose up, mixed with sadness for the nation's tragedy. People would later say that Clarissa never looked so young and beautiful as she had before that terrible day. But if the pain of that day took away her youthful glow, it left her with a meek and quiet spirit, a calmness and gentleness that some of us only gain after going through deep sorrow.